Okay, so let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Richard Espinosa. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist based here in Los Angeles, but due to the gift of the internet, now I can be anywhere. I'm in the ether of the internet. So welcome everybody. Thank you for attending part 4, the final part of my Summer Pride series. This year in 22, I've gone online. So these are more webinars. We took a pause in 2020, started things up again in 2021 with the unique hybrid that was going on in education during the time. And this year we're doing things solely online. So just setting the tone. I mean, I'll get to this in a few moments. Just feel free to interject with any questions or comments you have throughout the lecture. I actually don't want it to be lecture style. I prefer more of a Socratic method. And today we're going to talk about allyship. The marketing and posing for all of this appeared as specifically allyship to the queer community, but you'll find it's intersectional, and we'll get into understanding what all of that means, in just a few moments. So first off, if you're showing up outside of Pride Month, like it is today on July 7th, you already got some brownie points for allyship. Many people have observed what we call the corporatization of Pride, where big corporations or institutions will celebrate and note Pride to the queer community through June and then fiercely stop as of July 1st. So that's part of the reason why this lecture was set for today, this webinar. And if you showed up for this already, you're already ahead of the game in terms of allyship to the queer community. So let me, for myself, move my little toolbar down. All right. So first off, what is an ally and who do they support? So the conglomerate of this talk's tips and resources, they come from over a decade of patient care within the LGBTQ folks that I've worked with in both the San Francisco Bay Area and the greater Los Angeles area of California. And for this talk, an ally is defined as someone who makes efforts to hold space for, support, defend, and advocate on behalf of members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersectional, questioning, androgynous, pansexual, intersex, two-spirit, and asexual community, despite those efforts not directly impacting them. So often we hear the queer alphabet of LGBTQ with an elemental P, all these other letters. So I wanted to distill that all into right here what that is. Basically, anyone who doesn't identify or fully feel they're a part of the heterosexual dominant community. So LGBTQ can also be known as gender and sexual minorities in academia. So maybe in scholarly papers, or I might even say GSM. That's what academics have been using in the recent decade to describe, people of the queer community. So if you hear gender and sexual minorities, it's the same thing. And then also, LGBTQ plus can also be known colloquially and playfully as the alphabet mafia. I hear that a lot with Gen Z, and I think it's pretty cute, actually. But that's who we're talking about and who this talk is geared towards. So anyone who may identify within the queer community and is looking to maybe better receive allyship or advocate for allyship, or people outside of the queer community who want to still hold space and support them. If you fall into any of those categories, this talk is warmly welcoming to you all. Okay. Now, again, one doesn't really have to qualify to attend this talk. You may already know someone. You may already have a loved one, a neighbor, a coworker, or your partner may be a part of the queer community when you're not. And so again, anyone with a vested interest in supporting this community and the intersectionalities that may apply, you're warmly welcome to be here. All right. So let's set the tone of today's talk. So first and foremost, the goal of this talk is not to call people out. It's to call people in. So often, one of the main challenges I hear in allyship is people either being nervous or feeling like if they attend an event, a space that doesn't belong to them, that they're going to be called out or that other people are going to unload their experiences onto people trying to learn allyship. So again, the goal of this talk is to call people in, not call people out. We need our allies, and you typically don't make solid allies by judging them from the get-go. So the intention of this talk is to meet folks where they're at, with an understanding that allyship can be on a spectrum. We're not expecting people to fully commit their lives to a cause that doesn't directly impact them, but this is to kind of wet people's whistle and to, again, meet people where they're at. Some people may want to be, like, for example, a PFLAG parent, and that's great. Some people may merely want to be able to hold conversations about queerness out in daily life. And again, on that spectrum, everyone here is welcome. On that note, I mean, with recent political climate and current events, many people in the United States are already feeling widespread oppression, sometimes for the first time. So for example, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Many people, especially our female identified sisters within the community or outside of the community, are maybe feeling a sense of oppression, and that's systemic. The US government may be lending people a sense of lack of protection, or, like the word I've been using, oppression. So let's all try to speak Socratically, so that we can hear the experiences and questions that people may have during this talk. So feel free, if you're more extroverted, just unmute yourself and just ask me a question. Hey, Dr. E, I want to know about this, or can you explain that more? Or can I share my experience? Totally fine. Some people, like my introverts, feel more comfortable messaging it. So I will periodically check in the chat box and be able to see if any people have any questions that they've written to everyone or directly to me. Also, let's strive to also discuss how to both provide and receive support amidst moments of sometimes blindness, sometimes oppression, or sometimes hate. Blindness is taken from, like, the term color blindness, where sometimes people would mistakenly say, oh, I don't see color. I don't see race, I don't see ethnicity. That's not as effective here. So there are moments of blindness to the queer community that we'll be able to discuss. There may be moments of oppression that we will definitely explore, and sometimes there's moments of straight up hate that we can also process and look at here. Okay, and true to form, let me see if there's any questions. Okay, don't see any questions in the chat box. Some people also like the little emoji hand to raise their hand. I don't always see that, so if you have your hand up, again, feel free to unmute yourself or type your question or comment in the chat box. Okay. So the basics on how to provide allyship. So some of the basics of this topic is simply learning what the LGBTQ+ community is, what the history of the queer community holds, and what are current events, what's going on now for the queer community. Educating oneself on the marginalized population that they plan to support and provide allyship to is crucial. So another thing to understand is that marginalized communities may use unfamiliar terminology and lingo. So I'm not saying full on learn all the lingo and terminology, because that's quite a big feat, but maybe strive to make efforts to at least understand that the community you're attempting to support may have a common language that you need to, educate yourself on and simply ask questions about when you need to. Also, the basics of allyship: look into, research, Google, or ask members of the community how they can help, how you can be of use or service, or ask for any moments of slights, or again, moments of blindness or oppression or hatred that need to be understood for members of the community. These are all the basics of allyship. And when coming in as an ally, I don't want to assume that allies come in with privilege, but it's good for anyone striving to be an ally to any marginalized community to understand how their identity as an ally may hold a certain level of privilege, and how that privilege can be both, used for good and also sometimes relinquished. So some resources at the bottom of this slide here to develop these fundamentals in allyship. We have GLAAD's, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. We also have a link to the Genderbread Person, which in my opinion, really beautifully and easily describes the differences between gender, sex, and the intersectionalities between that. We also have the IMI guide, which is a great resource. It's an online resource, particularly geared towards younger populations, so Gen Z and adolescents overall. I think that's great. And also, one can always educate themselves through PFLAG. That's the Parents and Family of Lesbian and Gays. Not exclusive just to lesbian and gay, but that's the terminology that was used when this organization was established. And then also the Safe Zone Project can also provide good history on the queer community and can talk about current events and how we can support the community going forward. So feel free to use any of these resources in the future. Okay. So allyship doesn't have to be exclusive to the queer community. Humans are multifaceted creatures, and intersectionality, where our different identities may intersect within us, is definitely a thing. So when I talk about intersectional allyship here, the research and data on allyship used in this talk inevitably stems from allyship towards various marginalized groups. So accordingly, queer people may have intersecting identities. So for example, you may be queer and also a person of color. You may be queer and also belong to a religious order that may be marginalized. You may be queer and also non-binary, which are two different things. That's gender and one sexual orientation. You may be living with different abilities. So these are all just some examples of where intersectionality can come into play. Another really good thing to explore within oneself with allyship is to understand what implicit bias is and how it may hinder one's allyship. Implicit bias is the unconscious beliefs and understandings we may have either in support of or against a certain community, often marginalized communities. So for example, what if a person is queer and has a racial or ethnic identity? So for example, Black trans lives are disproportionately impacted by violence, and that's not always given the attention it deserves. That's one example of the intersectionality where allyship can apply. One can support people of color and transgender individuals and queer people. Another example is what happens if you're queer and maybe you are female identified. Recently in this country, reproductive rights, have been a huge topic. And for example, us in California, we may deal with the onslaught of people with uteruses that may go out of state for safe abortions. So how can we support people of that community while it may not directly impact us? Like if you're male identified like myself, abortion rights do impact everybody. And how, for using myself as an example, how can I be an ally to people subjected to this level of oppression? Another example is, what if you're queer and your citizenship status in the United States is up in the air? So for example, a queer person could be applying for asylum due to their GSM status being illegal in their home country. So there's many ways that our various identities intersect, and that breeds many rich opportunities for us to be an ally to people who belong to multiple marginalized groups. Any questions so far? Okay. So let's get into it. There are so many different ways one could be an ally to the queer community and all communities in different facets of our lives. So let's start with school, with academia. So allyship for educators. So some of the recommendations, these come from my personal experience in academia. This comes from my work with people who are educators and people who are students. So starting off, if you're comfortable as an educator, feel free to let students know that you strive to be an ally in all facets. Just let them know, I can hold space for you, or I can just lend an ear if you're having a problem. Not necessarily calling out individually these students like in class, but just letting it be known. hey, if any of you students ever have anything you want to discuss or feel is we can't talk about it in class, but it's something that's weighing on your mind, know that you can always talk to me. As an educator, it really behooves you to be observant and check in with your students overall, not just members of the queer community, calling them out, but if you see something or if you detect something with your students, always be mindful and check in with them. This could be personal check-ins. This could be shooting them a quick email. This could be just holding space for them and just telling them to talk to you after class or during their lunch, things like that. If you want to take it an extra step as an educator, you could be the advisor or even promote an LGBTQ affirming student organization. Back in my time, there was the Gay Straight Alliances. I think they're changing their names now. I think it's just a queer student union, I'm hearing, at least in California. But if those exist at the institute you teach for, feel free to promote them. Or if they don't exist, you can take up the challenge and leadership of becoming an advisor for these student groups. From personal experience, a GSA started in one of my years in high school, and that was a wonderful space. The teachers that advised it were very queer affirming, and as an adolescent, I felt like there was a safe space in my school, which is really valuable because that's a space that helps form our identities. In the classroom, as an educator, feel free to set norms of inclusion and define, if you feel comfortable, what words of affirmation and words of hate could be. So letting students know these words are harmful or offensive and educating the students on why they're harmful or offensive. And at the same time, as the teacher in the room, educators can also educate on what it is to support people. So an educator is one of the people who can just even define what allyship is and can set the tone and the norms for what's okay in the classroom and what's not. As an educator, in the classroom as well, and just amongst students in general, feel free to intervene if you hear bullying, or if you hear bullying, take a step further and educate on why whatever you heard as an educator could be offensive and hurtful to the student's own education and growth. Moving on, you can always strive to acknowledge or create safe spaces on campus. I've seen in different campuses just a quick printout of a rainbow triangle, pride triangle saying safe space. Posting that outside of someone's office or having some sort of icon like that in one's office really speaks a good message that I am someone you can come to talk about these things. Students really look up to their educators, whether we acknowledge it or not. So all of these little symbols, all of these little gestures of allyship really go far. And as an educator, it's part of our skill set. You can provide resources, education on queer history, queer laws, queer health, and other specific queer topics. I get that some states have the no promo homo laws where you're not allowed to talk about queer matters overall. So, if it risks losing your job, always be mindful and take that into account. But know that as an educator, you hold a lot of power and you hold a lot of ability to educate, your students on what queerness is, what the history is, and what allyship and support for that community can look like. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So on the other end, the flip side of the coin, allyship for students. First off, don't bully. If you feel like anything that may come out of your mouth or has come out of your mouth as a student may have been offensive, stop. Also, if you hear bullying or hatred or oppression, you can always intervene when you hear it at school. People, this next bullet point, some people kind of get on me about, but if you feel comfortable and if you already have established educators who have identified as allies, report any violence you hear or see to those staff members who have let you know that they're an ally. Now in the modern era, students have email accounts and educators do as well. So maybe you don't want to talk about it overtly, or maybe you don't feel comfortable in the moment to say like, hey, that's bullying. But at a later time, you can email someone who's identified themselves as an allied staff member, and to hopefully form this network of safety within the classroom. If queer student groups do exist on campus, as a student, feel free to participate as an ally. Feel free to participate in safe spaces, or simply let other students know that you also are an ally, that you're also someone that you feel comfortable with queer people come to you with a question or something that they'd like to discuss. And this next bullet point, I'm going to repeat ad nauseum. It's like each slide, but a simple way to let people know that you're an ally is to state your pronouns. So if you're meeting a new person, you can just say, hi, I'm Carlos. I use he, him, his. Or you can say, hi, I'm Charlotte. I use they, she. Letting people know right off the bat that you are aware and are concerned how people identify through their pronouns and their gender identity and expression, that already sets the tone that, okay, this person's cool. I can probably talk to them about some of these matters. If you are a student who is LGBTQ, I can't emphasize this enough. Take up your educators on their allyship. If an educator has let it be known that they want to support the queer community and you are queer, take them up on it. That can be as simple as just talking to them after class, again, shooting them emails, letting your educators know about moments of hate or bullying you've experienced, and talking amongst, and if you feel safe and comfortable enough, talking with your student allies about this, forming that network and strengthening it. Periodically, if you can, as a queer student, check in with your allied educators, maybe even set up like regular times to meet with them. Check in with the school counselor if you need to. Just really take people up on their allyship. That's again why, jumping back to the last slide, as educators, you hold a lot of power. So letting it be known that you are there to support people is invaluable. Again, if you're a queer student, begin to start thinking about the people that you love and that the people who you know already support you. These are the foundational roots of developing your chosen family. And if you've attended some of the previous talks, I've emphasized the dire importance of forming a family of choice. Not many of us queer people always have the most receptive and supportive family of origin, but that doesn't have to hold you back. Forming your own family, forming your own network of people who you love and hold dear just as equal to or even more than your family of origin, the people you share DNA with, that can be a great substitute for not always having the most supportive relatives. Okay, let me just check the chat box. Okay, we're good. All right, so allyship in the workplace. So I have people from out of state in attendance. So, things are different. Not everywhere is the oasis that is California. And I love this state and I'm loyal to it. So within the workplace, many people have jobs and queer people definitely exist in the workforce. So strive to understand what pro-LGBTQ plus laws are in place for people in the workplace, and also strive to understand what anti-LGBTQ workplace laws or policies may be in place. And this can be as simple as a Google search, just typing, okay, if I'm in Michigan, for example, what are pro-LGBTQ policies in the workplace, or what are anti ones? And that can give you all the list of things to just be aware of in the workplace. Also, the thing I'm going to repeat this whole time, a nice, easy way to let coworkers know that you're an ally. Try to learn the pronouns of your coworkers and also, again, use your own. It's easy to state your own preferred use of pronouns than asking someone what they use. from the feedback I hear from the queer people I work with, they much prefer if someone else states their pronouns first rather than asking theirs. Not to say that don't ask someone, because always, if you have a question, simply just ask the person respectfully. But I've just heard people prefer to hear it out of the mouths of their allies first. It sets a tone and it sets a space of safety. So understand in the workplace too, my opinion has always been the workplace asks of us a strange, delicate dance between authenticity and professionalism that people are still trying to figure out to this day how to navigate that in the workplace. So some examples of that could be, what if you choose to have pictures of your partner and your family, on your desk? Or what if you just in pleasantry conversation want to ask, oh, what did you do this weekend? And let's say that weekend you spent it with your partner. Remember that using partner helps to neutralize the space, and it helps to let people know that you are open to people having a partner that may be of a different or the same gender as yourself and as them. So questions such as like, oh, are you married? Oh, do you have a spouse? Those sometimes come from a place of privilege, which not always, but questions like that inevitably do kind of ask for someone's disclosure. So if you ask someone, oh, are you married? Well, ultimately that asks, yes or no. And if someone is married, inevitably it does ask, what is the gender of that person? And that inevitably asks, what is your sexual orientation? So just know these things as an ally in the workplace. Know how these questions can be construed by other people. Again, another one is to neutralize when talking about oneself. If one is partnered, simply using the neutral term of partner, again, lets people know that you're privy to not everyone has a opposite gendered, spouse. If in the workplace you hear microaggressions or insults, feel free to challenge them. And we'll get into tips a few slides from now on what are some direct ways to challenge any microaggressions or hatred one may hear. Directly, if a simple Google search doesn't fulfill this, you can speak directly to HR with your company and learn what the current policies are that impact the queer community and the queer staff. Just remember, HR, it's their job to inform you on what the policies are. So always go to them if you aren't sure on how the company you work for treats queer matters. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, understand the corporatization of Pride even after June. The corporatization of Pride, it's the phenomena in June where many companies will just slap a rainbow on their logo and often make good efforts to show they're inclusive, and then that magically disappears July 1st. So understand if the culture of your workplace is like this. First off, if your workplace supports Pride, even just for the month of June, that still is a progressive step. And as an ally in the workplace, you can even strive to hold events outside of the month of June. Like we have so many queer holidays, not federal holidays, but we have so many things. So like in October, National Coming Out Day, you can talk to HR or you can talk to your higher ups about maybe just acknowledging that day, or maybe even having events for, National Coming Out Day or any other queer matters. In the workplace, you can join or form DEI groups, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes there's task forces, or sometimes there's groups or process groups. And so ask your HR if these exist in your workplace. These are little oases. These are safe havens for queer people in the workforce. Any questions on that? Okay. Yeah, check in the chat box. All right. Okay.
I'm just letting you know. I'm looking it up. I'm going to put in the chat box a resource for anyone who might be interested. USC Race and Equity Center. They have a really awesome thing they just started I think it's the first Wednesday morning of every month. This month was the second one they've done, and it's free and it's online, and it's all about like DEI in the workplace. So I'll put a link in there real quick.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Mannion.
Yes, I'm a part of the race equity and well-being, and we at USC, and we do have every Tuesday or every other Tuesday we have workshops. They've slowed down this summer, but that is something that is also out there from USC.
Yay, wonderful. Thank you, Janice. And Dr. Mannion, exactly, right here. So that's a Los Angeles-based resource. However, to my knowledge, they do things through webinars. So, the internet's everywhere. So wonderful. Thank you, you two, for reiterating this. And I see it right there. Okay, great. So the flip side of this, so we previously talked about educators, then we talked about students. Now we're talking about corporations and also the consumers. So this is where I have to kind of hold my tongue a little bit, where my wannabe anarchist mind comes out. You hold a lot of power as a consumer of these companies. Arguably, corporations have a lot of power and maybe run this country. So what did they run on? Our dollars. They run on our support and our acknowledgement of their brand. So as consumers, you hold a whole lot of power. If you don't like how a corporation is acting, you don't have to support them. So let's get into some of the ways that you can be an ally and sometimes a rebel as a consumer. So first off, make efforts to support LGBTQ owned businesses. So this could be consuming, meaning giving them your dollars, doing online reviews, promoting LGBTQ owned businesses, or reposting and sharing on one's social media outlets for this. And it's actually quite simple to find out what businesses are LGBTQ owned. Just a quick Google search, Yelp search, and it'll show you these things. Like, I can speak from personal experience. When I incorporated my practice, Google and Yelp, and I'm forgetting which one, but a third one reached out to me and they said, oh, as the owner, do you identify under any of these intersections? And so I was able to endorse Latinx and LGBTQ. So they have it in their directory to say, like, if you just type in, I would like to just find queer-owned businesses, they have a directory. So it's very simple to find out these places. And not to say LGBTQ owned has to be the gold standard, but also if a company is just LGBTQ affirming, or at least gives space to queer people, feel free to support those companies. Always strive to be mindful of what corporations you support with your money. Again, your money is their lifeblood. So if you withhold your money and maybe redirect it towards queer affirming places, that speaks volumes and that speaks their language. Yay. Thank you for the resources in the chat box. And as a consumer, know the power of your voice, your online footprint, and again, your money. I've put the dollar sign so many times in this one slide because money talks. Money talks in this country. So you can advocate or even challenge these businesses, again, in online reviews, the comments section online, or you can communicate directly with a company's media team. There are typically staff members, the media team for companies, whose sole job is to take your feedback and your input as a consumer. And if you articulate your frustrations or support and praise for these companies, it's their job, it's the media team's job to listen to that and implement that into their business. So again, know the power of your voice with this. And dare I say, ask to speak to the managers when you're upset with something. It's their job to listen to the consumer's input. So for example, Black Lives Matter in Starbucks in 2020, when BLM was having its resurgence in 2020 after its implementation in 2013. If anyone recalls, in attendance, baristas were wearing like pins or just BLM paraphernalia, and Starbucks was not having it initially. What happened? The consumers used their voice, spoke up, and threatened to boycott Starbucks. And what happened? Within days, Starbucks released a statement saying that they were pro Black Lives and that their baristas were going to be allowed to wear BLM, paraphernalia. So again, as a consumer, your voice matters. Do you think Starbucks wanted to lose all that revenue? No. So they quickly changed their policies because the consumers spoke up, and that's good. Or this past year, this year as well too, Target stores with Juneteenth. There was a corporatization of Juneteenth at Target, and people spoke up, and it seems like going forward, they're going to change the tone and kind of the tone deafness of them corporatizing Juneteenth. So again, the consumers, you hold so much power. Speak up. Again, online reviews, speak directly to their media teams, or just on your own social media, post your experience. They have people who are paid and on staff to read through the comment section and to read whenever their name is mentioned. At the end of the day, they want good brand identity. So make them work for it. Make them work for your money. Okay. Yay, the chat box is on fire. Okay, moving on.
Dr. I'm sorry.
Hmm?
I have one question. I've been really struggling with the corporatization of things like Juneteenth and various June for Pride Month and the different minority groups that have months and are it feels very exploitative. Exploitive.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations are, while we want the acknowledgement for our various months, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around how to encourage corporations in particular, since they have such a high profile with advertising and media, to encourage them to continue to do the things that they're doing in June, in July, and August, and September, rather than just selecting the month of choice. I hope that's clear. I'm trying to figure out how we can make LGBTQ, Black lives, Asian and American, Pacific Islander, Native American concerns more of a continuum throughout the year than just the months that we honor or celebrate them. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts around that.
Yeah, thank you.
Corporations.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Janice. I can just speak from what I personally do. I've made efforts to, again, understand the power of my voice as a consumer. So when I'm scrolling through ads, most ad distributors have a little section where you can thumb up or thumb down. And it'll ask you, oh, you like this? Okay, we'll keep showing you more. Oh, you don't like this? Why? I use that as my opportunity to provide feedback. So if I do a thumb down, they'll say why. And I can say, well, this doesn't feel inclusive outside of this month where, yeah, maybe you're trying to exploit my community. So I gave a thumb down. Why? I'd like to see more inclusion. I'd like to see inclusion that extends outside of this one period of time. And you can even use terms like this feels exploitative. It would feel more inclusive if I saw this, throughout the year. So personally, that's what I do. I provide all the feedback they want because, again, these companies, their lifeblood is our feedback and our dollars.
Thank you.
Okay. So directing things now for healthcare professionals. This is a real, clearly because I work in healthcare, this is a very crucial part. Healthcare professionals in general, we hold space for people who are typically not going through the best times of their life. The United States arguably has sick care, not healthcare. So we tend to meet people at the most vulnerable states in their lives, including, especially in the mental health field. So if we strive to make our clinics, our facilities, safe spaces for all marginalized communities, including the queer community, again, that helps promote safe zones. And what I've always jokingly called it, you can turn your safe zone into a war room. We can arm members of the community with knowledge on how to go out and, help advocate. So again, healthcare professionals, brandish your flags, okay? Little things like wearing a pride pin on your white coat, posting safe zone signs, and again, listing your pronouns sometimes on your badges that they have at clinics. That goes a long way. That lets people know, okay, this person is brave enough to adorn their body with support from my community. So that really sets the tone with patients, what I've noticed. For specifically mental health clinicians, try starting therapy again with stating your pronouns and, dare I say, your sexual orientation. I know it sounds strange at first, and for some of my mental health clinicians, we're taught to keep more of a neutral stance and not to insert ourselves into the room. Personally, I feel it can be skillfully done because you're another human in the room. You present with intersectionalities that the other person can perceive on. I mean, someone can look at my last name and go, oh, they're probably Hispanic. Someone could look at someone's skin tone and be like, oh, they're probably not of my community. So for mental health clinicians, starting with our pronouns and even stating, I am queer or I am this, lets people know that they can open up about these matters too in talk therapy. It doesn't have to be a two-way street, but it can definitely let the person know that the one-way street of therapy, they're not talking to a blank wall, and they're talking to someone who holds their own identities, acknowledges their own identities, and is willing to talk to you as the client about your intersectionalities. It's for my psychology people, this more takes a humanistic stance where it comes from a place of collaboration, where talk therapy is really most effective when it's a collaborative partnership. And it's just culturally more responsive. So that's my little soapbox for mental health clinicians. Moving on to medical doctors and physicians, try attending continuing education courses that are specific to LGBTQ plus medicine. So I'm not saying become, a hormone replacement therapy specialist or just magically, change your specialty, but you are allowed to attend continuing education courses that are outside of your specialty, just so you're privy to these intersections in medicine. So, and again, in the United States, we really value medical doctors. We see them as the authority in things. And I don't see that as a negative, but use that very privileged platform to educate yourself on queer medicine. For health professionals, the admin staff. Hopefully people acknowledge how important the admin staff is. They are the eyes and ears of a clinic. So if you're a part of the admin staff, educate yourself on the facility's pro and anti-LGBTQ policies. Like, do you work for a clinic that still has the archaic law that you can't receive blood donations from someone who identifies as having same-sex relations in the past year? Is that a thing? Can you be fired for being a member of the queer community while still working in healthcare? Educate yourself and disseminate this knowledge to the staff at large if you can. And again, remember admin staff, the power of properly gendering people. As with the admin staff, you're sometimes the first face they see of a facility. So if right off the bat, you're calling someone, Miss Clark, and they identify as a male, that's not always going to set an affirming tone for people. Okay. And then overall, all healthcare professionals, make efforts to correct oneself and take a non-judgmental stance whenever possible. We don't know. I mean, these people are coming to us in a state of vulnerability. So coming in with a tone of judgment or a tone of, I already know what your experience is, without being curious as to what their experience is, that's the difference. Come in with a curious tone with what your patients may present, rather than coming in like you already know what the experience is. And moving on. Inevitably, we're humans. We're going to step on people's toes. Our toes are going to be stepped on. So strive to understand that mistakes, microaggressions, or hate may occur in a clinic. It just happens. So should these events happen, which they likely will, acknowledge the missteps a provider may make. As always, educate oneself on the communities that you're working with, and if possible, make amends when patients are impacted. You will never understand, well, you will never understand the power of when a doctor, a provider comes from a place of vulnerability and realizes, you know what, I may have just misgendered you. Is that okay? Or my intervention I just suggested, does that sound feasible, or does that sound too out of line? Did I misstep? Did I step on your toes? Personally, that's the phrase I use, and it's usually met with a warm reaction. Even if I did step on someone's toes, the fact that I acknowledge they may have stepped on their toes really helps facilitate a beautiful doctor-patient relationship. And as always, educate yourself on how comments can be offensive or hurtful. And especially for healthcare professionals, it really behooves us to know the terminology of whatever communities we work with, including, of course, the queer community. Because we are healthcare professionals, we're also health educators. Learn to suggest alternatives. So if you hear a slight, a microaggression, maybe help in privacy and confidence. If you see it amongst another provider, maybe in confidence or during a staff meeting, let them know, alternatives like, hey, maybe you could have been more affirming to their partner, or maybe it's helpful to not assume the gender of their partner that they speak of, things like that. Also, for healthcare professionals, particularly to the queer community, there's a greater need for sexual health and STI medicine and gender affirming medicine. So always try your best to understand resources, what they're available. And again, as a healthcare provider, it's your job to provide affirming resources. So make efforts to have that information, maybe print it out, and maybe have handouts available for your patients. Okay. And remember, we're going to step on people's toes, or people will step on our toes. So it's about repetition, repetition, repetition. None of us are going to be the best ally for another group right off the bat. We're always striving to be a good ally. Okay, just checking the chat box. Okay. All right. Now let's move towards allyship to our communities at large. In my opinion, it starts with just normalizing allyship in everyday discussion. So even if, like, let's say with current events, I'm just using myself as the example. I am male. I'm probably never going to get pregnant. Therefore, I'm never going to have to debate if I'm ever going to have an abortion or such. But normalizing the conversation without hijacking conversations, which I know is a delicate dance, but normalizing allyship in everyday discussion goes far, goes really far. And I know it requires a little bit of bravery, but yes, if you don't belong to a marginalized community and you know that allyship is going to be very helpful to that community, simply talking about the current events and your experience of the current events can help set the tone for that. As an ally, strive to attend queer spaces or acknowledge that ally. And when you do strive to attend queer spaces, so this could be asking to go to Pride with some of your queer friends, or doing research on going to like a ball, like a ballroom culture, like where they have like voguing and stuff. Ask to attend these spaces. If you attend a queer space as an ally, just always go in with the healthy knowledge that you are a guest, but not the special guest star. That's often one of the large challenges I hear from people who are part of marginalized communities receiving allyship. It's wonderful that allies are attending, but show up, but try not to be the starlet of the scene. The reason queer spaces exist are for people of that community to shine. That's their space. If you do out in the community attend queer spaces, be mindful of tokenizing and stereotyping, even at gatherings. I can use from a personal experience. I was at a therapist gathering, and people were talking about music, and someone mentioned, "Oh, Richie, Lady Gaga, like you all like her," and I was like, just because there's a stereotype that gay men love Lady Gaga, that stereotyping wasn't appreciated in that space, and it was an assumed space for queer professionals. So That's just one example from personal life. Again, pronouns, pronouns, pronouns. Especially in mixed company, start getting comfortable with stating one's pronouns when meeting new folks. You may be met with a bit of like, huh? A bit of confusion, but it starts to normalize the conversation. I remember the first time I heard someone say, just for example, oh, my name is Bob, she, they. And I was like, she, they, like, is that a word? But it educated me on someone introducing their name and then stating their pronouns immediately after. So that was a moment of allyship I needed to learn for the trans community. So with striving to provide allyship in marginalized communities, make efforts to be mindful, be observant, and try to spot and then work towards adjusting heterosexism out in everyday life in the community. So one example of heterosexism, just jumping back to the workplace example I used, maybe not saying, oh, this weekend, me and my wife went to the river and we took the boat out, just saying me and my partner, noting that having the privilege and the safety and comfort to state the gender of your partner, that's privileged. That's a privileged stance. So note that may be rooted in heterosexism. Or asking, I'm trying to think of another example right now. Just heterosexism is just the understanding that that's the way the world works. Most relationships are between male and female, assigned at birth, and that's just how the way it is. So make efforts to understand that and then maybe deconstruct that in everyday life. So some of the examples there are assuming the gender of people, maybe treat people as gender neutral until stated or proven otherwise. Also parts of heterosexism, it's the assumption that people are heterosexual until they disclose their queer status. Try to make efforts to deconstruct that in one's mind. So again, people are gender neutral and people are not asexual because that's its own orientation, but maybe you just don't know someone's sexual orientation until they feel comfortable to disclose it to you. And as always, acknowledge the missteps, educate yourself, dive into all the research or Google searches you can if possible. And again, if you've realized that someone's toes have been stepped on, try to make efforts to normalize the conversation and normalize making amends. It's very hard. I'm in the business of crafting apologies or understanding where we've hurt each other or been hurt. So taking the steps to apologize to someone for a slight, that gets you a whole lot of allyship brownie points because it's hard. Okay, chat box is good. Any questions so far? Get some water real fast. All right. So this whole talk so far has been assuming that people already comfortably fall into their queer identities, but that's not always the case. So sometimes allyship will need to be applied to people when they're still figuring out who they are. They're still in the process of disclosing towards themselves and then maybe towards the world and the community at large, their gender or sexual minority status. So again, when supporting those who are still maybe in the coming out process or still acknowledging that they may be something other than heterosexual, again, normalize, normalize, normalize. Normalize the topics of gender and sexuality in everyday conversation. So it's as simple as acknowledging, Ricky Martin's partner, Juan Yosef, just acknowledging that he's a male, and then just going about your conversation with what you're talking about. If you were having a conversation about contemporary art, because that's what Juan is. He's a conceptual artist. But yeah, normalizing just queer topics and just not making a thing of it. That really helps, especially when people are trying to realize who they are. So if someone does come out to you, just always know that, and this has been a topic, especially this current summer. So if someone comes out to you and they're met with the phrase, oh, I always knew, or I always suspected, know that it has mixed reception. So only you know the relationship with the person who's just disclosed this to you and come out to you. So just always use caution based on your understanding of the relationship with your loved one. If the two of you have like a sassy or a humorous tone, that may be received well. If you can tell that this person, it took a whole lot of courage and gumption for them to come out to you, then, maybe sentiments such as, oh, I always knew, maybe those can be kind of viewed as undermining sometimes. So again, only you know the relationship you have with the person disclosing this sensitive matter to you. So just implore with caution. If someone is in the process of coming out to you, understand that as an ally, disclosure isn't always linear. Okay. Some people may come out to one group of people and then a different group of people. Some people may come out to coworkers, but not come out to immediate family, or the opposite. Just understand it's not linear. And so make efforts to support people however they see fit in their coming out process. Queer persons may also need support in situations where they're forced to try and pass and go back in the closet, even temporarily. So acknowledge that it's so multifaceted when someone's coming out to you. And as an ally, you can just be in the unknown, sit in the ambiguity just as they are. And another pointer on allyship. So just note that when you inquire about someone's queer status, when you ask how you identify, this gives a person to confirm their identity, but also waiting for someone to disclose their queer status gives them a chance to affirm their identity. So again, only you know your relationship with that person, so choose accordingly. If you directly ask them how they identify, gives them a chance to assert who they are. If you wait for them to disclose their identity, it lets them affirm who they are. And just always note that asking yes or no questions asserts a level of privilege. So if I'm asking someone, are you Hispanic? Are you gay? Are you lesbian? That comes from a place of privilege. So just be mindful of how you ask these things if you do feel comfortable in asking someone's status. Yes.
Oh, sorry, Richard. I just wanted to share a story, I guess. I don't know, maybe everyone in the audience can tell me, but I used to find it odd that when LGBTQ folks would introduce themselves to me, they would have to say, I'm gay or I'm lesbian. So one thing I started doing is introducing myself back and saying I'm straight. And then people around us kind of would look at me like funny, kind of, why did you say that? So then it started conversations about, uncomfortable conversations, I guess, about why someone in the community would do that. And I thought it was helpful. And I was told later by my friends, by my LGBTQ friends, that was brave, I suppose. I didn't feel very brave, but at that moment I do feel that maybe I got a little bit of a taste of what it's like to actually disclose your sexual orientation, because it seems almost like, why is it necessary, right? Why is it necessary for anyone to disclose their sexual orientation in order to be friends? Or for instance, at work, why would anyone want to ask you that? Or why, you're not asking the straight folks, are you straight? No. So it was a moment that I didn't really think twice. I just thought, I'm just going to say it because, they're choosing to disclose that to me, so I should disclose it as well. And it was met with a happy ending, I guess, or kind of like a thank you for doing that. You didn't need to do that. Anyway, I guess that there's that story. And I guess I just want to know from the audience, would that be helpful if straight folks were to react in that same way?
The floor is open. If anyone has a comment, or if anyone wants to put in the chat box, if they find that would be effective allyship, please feel free to put that in.
It's an interesting consideration. Like, one thing that I've always remembered is I studied abroad after my master's degree in Australia. I have a background in sports psychology, and okay. I was presenting on homophobia in sport. This is a long time ago. This is back in 2002, and throughout the talk, the talk was to other sports psychs in Australia at their Olympic training center, and I never disclosed my orientation. And one of my classmates, who had gone to this conference with me, who was a gay man, and he knew that I was straight. That afterwards he came up to me, and then he said that he was really impressed that I didn't disclose that I was straight, because like, if in his mind it was like, oh, I didn't feel a need to sort of like clarify, oh, but by the way, I'm straight, kind of thing. Like,
Right.
And so for him, so like that always stuck with me. So it's an interesting, like how it can sort of maybe be perceived in different ways.
Yeah, you know what? That is interesting. And the reason, I guess one of the reasons why I said it was because, so in my situation, to clarify, there were only 2 gay folks in the group of like 15 of us. And I thought, well, you shouldn't disclose that. But if you are, let me disclose it too, because I guess if we're going to go share it, like everyone should be sharing that, right? So I guess, and it could have backfired on me. It could have been one of those things of like, why are you doing that, Vanessa? Or why you feel the need to do that. But I wanted to show like, yeah, I'll disclose as well. So it's not just 2 out of like the 15 that are in this group that are disclosing, because I felt that was super unfair.
Yeah.
Janice?
I have one comment or question. I think the other thing, or at least the way I'm hearing it, is that maybe identifying themselves as members of the LGBTQ community helps them to be seen in that space as who they are. When I show up in a space, I am very clearly Black. I'm very clearly female. And so I don't have to explain that. But maybe there, and I could pose this to the rest of the group, maybe there is a need to express one's sexual orientation in order to be seen in that room before other conversations maybe start off in ways that may not be favorable. Or maybe it's a way to test the waters to see if I'm, in an allied space, and do I want to be in that space as an LGBT person. So that feels like what that could have been. But I agree that maybe, like Dr. E was saying, knowing the space that you're in can also dictate how you respond to that. That's my thought.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Janice, Vanessa, Dr. Mannion.
Oh, I have to clarify for ethics. I'm ABD, so I'm not Dr. Mannion yet, but I appreciate it. I love the sound of that this fall. I will really appreciate it.
For everybody, ABD means it's the colloquial for all but dissertation. So one's in their doctoral program, but hasn't completed that last pesky thing of the dissertation filing.
Correct.
Okay, my mistake. So yes, thank you everybody for this input. This helps us define what privilege is. So I'll use myself as the example. Last night, I had the choice of watching the news. I had a choice of watching the conflict evolving in Ukraine. I had the choice of watching the Supreme Court and that fiasco that's going on. I had the choice to either engage or not engage. It's similar, we can crosswalk that to just being heterosexual. A heterosexual person does not have to disclose their sexuality. Due to heterosexism, we assume everyone's straight until proven queer. So yes, thank you, Vanessa, for that example. That's a moment of relinquishing one's privilege, which is a brave and more challenging way to provide allyship. Because when you think about it, it's bizarre. Queer people at some point have to acknowledge and disclose their orientation, but heterosexuals don't. They have the choice, the privilege to either engage in that conversation in that way or not. So that's actually one of the higher levels of allyship that comes into being an accomplice, which we'll get to near the end of today's talk. That is relinquishing one's privilege. That is acknowledging and putting oneself out there saying, I am straight. As bizarre as it sounds, I'm straight. And because yes, that dog whistles to everyone that this person is willing to talk about these things. So I think that was a beautiful example, Vanessa, of one way that one could temporarily relinquish their privilege in order to hold space for others and to facilitate a sense of exploration and safety in a group. So thank you. Continuing on with this, if someone is coming out to you, try to use more direct language rather than passive language. Instead of saying, oh, if you're queer, I don't care either way, or I don't care either way if you're lesbian or gay or whatever. Tones like that aren't always the most effective. So instead of saying, I don't care either way, or it doesn't bother me, or, you know, I don't see color, I don't see sexuality, simply stating, if you are LGBTQ, know that I love and support you. That's just one example to be more affirming than passive. Remember, as allyship, it involves a little bit of proactivity, actually a lot of proactivity. So it's better to state things than imply things. It's better to state and acknowledge your allyship and support than to imply it. Okay, and we'll get to some hiccups now. So this is a conglomerate of things I've heard in personal life, from personal contacts and clients alike, and students. So always remember that transitioning is a process that begins inwards and extends outwards on a trans person's own time. So just always acknowledge that. So if someone has let you know that they're transitioning and you see them on the street and they don't look how you think they should look towards the gender they are transitioning towards, know that it takes time. Another hiccup, if you happen to misgender somebody, simply apologize and learn their correct pronouns. That's also a moment of relinquishing one's privilege. Apologizing is very hard, especially in this country. Our culture, very individualistic. People will do anything than apologize, because apologizing implies that I know I made a mistake, and people don't like to acknowledge that. So that's another moment of relinquishing privilege. Sentiments such as "you don't seem gay," if someone is in conversation with you and has disclosed their sexuality, it's rarely taken as a compliment, and it may even reinforce inauthenticity. If any of you attended my straight acting talk, we explored this, more in depth. As I've stated before, just be mindful of the space you take up in queer spaces. And that's for any marginalized space. If you're at a space that wasn't made for you, but is welcoming to you, acknowledge that and just be mindful of not trying to be the special guest star. If people are coming out, let them come out on their own time. Again, only you know your relationship with that loved one. If you feel comfortable enough to kind of probe, or at least set the tone that you're open to talk to them about their burgeoning identity, still acknowledge, let them do it on their own time. Just always acknowledge too, if someone is stating anything about their marginalized identities, know that that is privileged information, and this person is entrusting a whole lot of valuable information with you. And in some instances, not just strict to sexuality and gender identity, people sharing with you this privileged information, it could mean life or death for them in certain cases. So never forget the power of knowledge. I mean, to quote Freud himself, secrets make us sick. So if someone is disclosing something, releasing a secret in an effort to be more authentic and help themselves, know that they trust you. Appreciate that. Also, another big thing in allyship, learn what appropriation is. Learn what being a culture vulture is. Learn what these efforts are, and try not to appropriate a culture. You can appreciate a culture without taking the positive and just leaving the negative due to your privilege. Like, for example, people say yes right now, or like the yesification of things. That's taken directly from ballroom culture, a Black, often trans space. So that's an example of appropriating. You take the positive, the humor, but you don't take the marginalization, you don't take the negativity and stigma that's come with it. So just be mindful of appropriation and being a culture vulture. Okay, a big one, performative allyship. And I'm just going to read it directly from the quote. Performative allyship for this talk is defined as citing buzzwords or creating social media posts to perform allyship with rudimentary understanding of race and racism, and gestures that promote the significant moral compass of an individual, as opposed to dismantling oppressive systems. So a lot of allyship research comes from, as I stated in the beginning, religious minorities and ethnic minorities. So this quote was adapted from that. So performative allyship one way to define it also is it's performing allyship until one is personally impacted. So in order to make efforts to avoid performative allyship, simply ask yourself, some of the following questions. So what if my child, for example, came out as non-binary? Would I still identify as an ally? Would I still unconditionally support and love them? Will I march also when it's not a parade? That's a big thing. You can show up for the Pride Parade for all the fun and rainbows, but will you show up when it's a protest or a demonstration? Also, strive to ask yourself, what if my favorite brand, for example, donated millions of dollars to a conversion therapy camp? Again, the power of your dollar. You can also ask yourself, am I marching at a protest, for example, just for the pictures, just for the social clout? Ask yourself, am I bringing heteronormativity to queer spaces? Like, for example, if you're just saying, I spent time with my wife for the weekend, know that you're bringing in heteronormativity in that sentence alone. Do I treat my queer loved ones as an accessory? Ask yourself that. These are all sample questions to ask oneself to avoid performative allyship. Again, it's allyship until you're personally impacted or it's less convenient for you. So for example, if someone asked you as an ally, if someone asked if you were queer, how would you react? Would you take that as a compliment? Would you take that as an insult? Would that question your identity? Just ask yourself these things. And from Dr. Krause, a wonderful lecture I attended about a month ago, strive to understand the differences between LGBTQ informed and true allyship. LGBTQ informed, from that definition, is simply knowing that queer people exist, knowing that there may be laws against them or there may be laws supporting them, versus being an ally, someone who invests and is proactive in supporting this marginalized community. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm gonna run through these allyship tips. Dr. Zapulzio, she's a fellow speaker, I think, based in Chicago. I love her definition of privilege. Privilege is like being the home team. The home team is set to win. And that's also my sports psych people can appreciate that. Picture privilege like that. Privilege is the ability to not engage in something that is harmful or oppressing others. And it's like being the home team. Everything is set for the home team to win at a game. So some tips on allyship: speak up, then listen. Or as I've heard before, show up, then shut up. Your presence alone speaks volumes, and that's wonderful, but also strive to absorb knowledge when you show up for events and for causes. Try not to use or passively allow hateful language. So even if you didn't say it, but someone down the road said, oh, the printer's not working, oh, that's so gay, maybe educate the person on why that could be offensive. Try not to passively allow hate to be perpetuated. Framing life in hatred is just exhausting, honestly. So strive to learn what the terms heterosexism, homophobia, internalized homophobia, and homonegativity mean to the community. And again, with the first slides, which I will make these slides available on my website, all for the Summer Pride series. The resources I provided at the beginning, so like GLAAD, PFLAG, they can all help provide definitions of what these terms are, or the Safe Zone Project. Acknowledge and forgive yourself if you've ever been perpetuating or provided any help to the challenges that queer people hold. I often hear people of marginalized communities a bit frustrated because allies learning where they may have supported oppression or hatred almost want to confess to people of marginalized communities, and know that that's not necessary. You also don't need to reburden someone by venting and unloading your distress. Introspection and working on oneself as an ally is essential, in my opinion, and you don't have to unload on people of the marginalized community. You don't have to confess your sins to them in order to be an ally. And always, strive to take actionable steps to help. And this could be, you could protest, you can demonstrate, you can write letters to lawmakers. If you have a certain level of education or an understanding, you can teach or coach people how to write letters to lawmakers. You can coach or teach people how to lobby. You could simply just offer to be someone's contact call from jail if they're out protesting. I mean, allyship comes in many forms. So if you found a way to comfortably ally, well, teach that to others. And some more tips. Strive to ask how to help or what one can do in a situation to make it easier for the queer agenda, if you will. Call people out, including oneself, if you need to. As we've been discussing, learn to check and relinquish privilege often. Like me 2 talks ago, I misgendered the entire audience by saying you guys. And so this is me acknowledging and a little bit of apologizing for that moment. So this is me modeling what that relinquish of privilege could look like. I have privilege in this moment because I'm the one with the microphone on. And you have to acknowledge that. Question or empathically challenge any off-putting questions you may hear. So simply asking a person to repeat what they just said, gets them to rethink it. So this comes straight from FBI tactics on questioning people. So if someone says something that's off-putting or just rubbed you the wrong way, just have them repeat it. It'll force them to rethink it, and often they don't repeat it again. Simply asking the why do you ask retort. Like if someone is saying, oh, what's your sexual orientation? Why do you ask? Again, that gets a person to rethink why they just asked something coming from a privileged stance. You can also, if you hear hatred or off-putting comments, try the 4-second pause. Simply waiting, 1, 2, 3, 4, can really change the conversation. And it doesn't really involve much, just not talking for 4 seconds. It really gets a person to rethink what they just said. Or if you hear poor humor, ask them why the punchline is funny. Ask it to be explained. The quickest way to neutralize a joke, positive or negative, is to ask for the punchline to be explained. If you are at a place where your allyship is developing more and you hear slights, feel free again to suggest alternatives. Be like, well, maybe that couldn't have been said. Or, you know, when you asked Bob their sexuality moments ago, maybe you could have started with leading with what your orientation was before you asked someone something so personal. Again, as an ally, if you hold a platform, feel free to share that platform, disseminate info, and report or flag internet trolls. That's very powerful, actually. And remember, allyship starts small and it builds momentum. Allyship is a skill to develop, so no one's expecting you to be like the Queer as Folk mom who was like the ultimate PFLAG mom. No one is expecting you to be at that level of allyship, but you can strive to that. I want to also begin closing out with moments of unexpected allyship. So these are moments where it doesn't take much, but it goes far. So from personal and professional contacts, I've compiled these. So one moment that was invaluable for one person was their grandfather asking if their granddaughter had a boyfriend or girlfriend. They relayed that their grandfather took that pause and realized, oh, okay, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend? And this individual said that that really was so invaluable for them to understand that their grandfather was at least willing to hold these conversations. Another beautiful example I heard was an uncle helping pay the out-of-state rent for a niece who was kicked out of their home after coming out. So again, allyship can take many forms. Allyship can also take the form of taking a cousin to a clinic. No questions asked and not charging me for gas. That individual really wanted to emphasize that their cousin not charging them for gas to take them to the clinic was helpful. This is one I actually saw at a demonstration, editing one's BLM demonstration sign to include all Black Lives Matter. So it's about, again, repetition, repetition, repetition. We're always striving to edit and revise our allyship skills. I've also heard one individual relayed that a loved one showing up and translating for an appointment with a professional was invaluable. They were talking about working with an attorney due to their compromised citizenship status as a queer person. And one of their loved ones just showed up, no questions asked, and acted as a translator for them because there was a language barrier. One person relayed that my neighbor bought me my first pride flag and a book on being queer. So again, allyship comes in many forms. Okay, Now, evolving from allies to co-conspirators, which I think sounds just fun. So for this talk, the term co-conspirator is applied here and adapted from research on allyship among ethnic and religious minorities. Directly from Brittany Packnett, wonderful speaker. In her discussion entitled Visionary Voices, a Candid Conversation with Brittany Packnett, she breaks down a 3-tier framework of allyship. For her talk, it was specific to white allies to Black women. However, we can extrapolate to allyship overall, and particular to the queer community. So Packnett described the first tier of allyship as an ally, supporting a minority, I'll start that again. Ally, supporting a minority group when it's convenient. I know that the word convenient can kind of have a negative tone, but that's not intended here. It's just showing up when you can. That's not a problem. Or meeting people where they're at. That can evolve to being accomplice when an ally begins to shoulder some of this minority group's risk in their advocacy. And then it evolves to the co-conspirator stage when an accomplice starts being proactive in their advocacy. So of Packnett's 3-tier system, this is a framework that people can strive to fall into. But again, nothing is greater or worse than the other. So if you can only support and provide allyship when you are able to, totally fine. If you want to dive into the trenches with your queer sisters and brothers and want to act as a co-conspirator, knowing that you're going to be shouldering some of the risk and knowing that you're going to be advocating not always when it's convenient, then you're also welcome as a co-conspirator. Okay, so I'll get to my closing thoughts and then I'll relay some resources. So allyship, it comes in many forms and can be done in many places of our lives. For example, some choose to use their social media platforms to raise awareness, and others march alongside queer folks, and et cetera. We acknowledged here that while allies intend to contribute positively, sometimes it doesn't turn out that way. We also examined what effective allyship to the queer community entails and what it doesn't. We ended this discussion by exploring the candid stories from both allies and LGBTQ members in attendance. I want to thank everyone for showing up first off, participating, absorbing, and consuming this knowledge because we're going to need it, especially in the current political climate of the United States. Allyship across the board, across all intersections is going to be necessary. And it really behooves us all to acknowledge what points of privilege we may hold, and what marginalized identities we may also hold. We need to acknowledge when we're on the upside and the downside of privilege and how we can use our privilege for good and how we can receive and ask for help when we're on the downside of privilege and power. So some local Los Angeles resources are here. And again, these slides will be made downloadable off my website on my speaking page. We have some national resources